Hello, I'm Hannah Barnes, Associate Editor at the New Statesman. As we enter the first few weeks of this new Labour government, we'll continue to bring you daily episodes with our politics team to discuss and analyse the new direction being taken in the country. I'm joined today in the studio by the New Statesman's Associate Political Editor, Rachel Cunliffe, and our political correspondent, Freddie, Hayward. It's like we never went away.
On it goes.
Time has lost all meaning.
Restful weekend?
Not really.
Was there a weekend, Freddie?
We had a new cabinet to write about.
Yeah.
We did. Let's start there, as if by magic. Few surprises really in the cabinet. I mean, essentially the shadow cabinet kept their roles. One big surprise, which we'll come on to, but obviously with that result in Bristol Central and Thangham Debonair losing her seat, we got Lisa Nandy as Culture Secretary. Good to see her in the cabinet, Freddie?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, she was demoted last year, and it was seen as a sign that she wasn't as close to Lotto and Keir Starmer's team as she had been before. We got to remember Lisa Nandy stood against him in the leadership. First job she got was Shadow Foreign Secretary, then it was Levelling Up and Housing, and then it was International Development. So I think this is a sign that through her work as International Development, Shadow International Development Secretary, she's impressed Lotto, and we know that she's been working very closely with Lotto. She's been on those calls. The office, Keir Starmer's office, and that seems to have borne fruit. So, it's not a massive surprise that she's there. I don't think she had that much experience in that area, given that she spent 2 years on the foreign brief, but I think she'll be happy. That was the only surprise, really.
I would disagree, actually, with her not having sort of experience on it. So Culture Secretary is often called Minister for Fun because it's culture, media, sport. So they're the ones who get to go to football matches and concerts and things. But I think that the charity sector also comes under that brief, and a lot of the work that she did with Levelling Up is to do with community-based and the charity sector and working with local councils and all of that. So there's like a bit of experience there, although I couldn't tell you what football team she supports, and that is always the question that Minister England. It must be.
I assume it's
I mean, the biggest surprise really has been the Attorney General, hasn't it? Richard Hermer coming in. Emily Thornberry has been in the shadow cabinet in one form or another for 8.5 years, replaced by Richard Hermer, big human rights barrister, has been quite outspoken. He's a high-profile Jewish lawyer, has been quite outspoken on Gaza, has said clearly, I'm quoting here, almost impossible to conceive how an Israeli siege that denied civilians food and water could be in compliance with international law. Now, Emily Thornberry's actually handled it quite gracefully. She said she's very sorry and surprised not to be involved and appointed to the shadow cabinet, but he is a much more accomplished lawyer than I could ever hope to be. What do we make of this appointment, and what does it tell us about Keir Starmer?
So I think before we get to sort of his individual views on various topics, that role of Attorney General, it kind of depends what you want to do with it. So is it a cabinet position like any other cabinet position, and you give it to the people who in your party sort of high up, like, and that's how it's been treated by successive Conservative governments. I mean, Suella Braverman was Attorney General, let's not forget. Or is it
She's essentially, also a barrister,
she is. Yeah, I was going to say it does tend to go to a lawyer, which she is one.
It does go to a lawyer, but her sort of in terms of legal experience, what is the purpose of the job? Is it basically in-house counsel for the government? And that seems to be the way Keir Starmer is viewing this. He wants somebody in the post purely on their legal experience, not an MP who happened to be a lawyer before they were an MP, but a legal expert to kind of bring that area of expertise in. And I imagine this has a lot to do with the outlook for the government of wanting a government that kind of isn't overly politicised and is able to hold itself to account and is able to avoid some of the pitfalls that previous governments have got themselves into with legal and ethical issues.
Yeah, I mean, Keir Starmer clearly values expertise and experience over party loyalty. I think that Emily Thornberry's reaction was probably well judged, because we know that Keir Starmer does not appreciate briefings against other people or being unhappy with his decision. He'll expect loyalty, and if she does want to get into the cabinet in the future, that was definitely the right thing to do. The other thing, as you alluded to, Hannah, with Richard Hermer, is that he's said these things about Gaza, and he's pressed the government in the past to recognise that there's a strong chance that Israel's broken international law. Now he's sort of, the Keir Starmer's chief legal spokesperson. So that'll be fascinating to see. It's interesting as well that the Guardian's reported that Labour will probably drop the previous government's opposition to the ICC trying to impose jurisdiction over Gaza, which is really interesting. So we're already seeing some movements on Gaza. I mean, as we discussed on Friday, I think the election results will only reinforce the fact that Labour now recognise they need to show to voters that they're going to take a different approach to Gaza than the Conservatives.
And I guess the other legal battle that we saw with the old government over Rwanda, this new Labour government have said that that's dead. It was dead anyway, perhaps, but
it's day one, or depending on if you count Friday or Saturday as day one. Friday, Keir Starmer becomes Prime Minister. Yeah. Saturday, Rwanda is dead. So sort of that was probably their first, I would say, the first official act of the Labour government. Emily Thornberry, by the way, I think will absolutely, you'll be hearing more of her. I think she'll come back as a select committee chair, which Labour are now going to have many more of those than they did previously.
Which provides me with a perfect segue, in fact, into the ministerial appointments are really interesting. You mentioned select committee chairs there, who they're really, really important roles in Parliament, and we've got two former select committee chairs, if you like, coming back to work in the brief that they were chairs for. Haven't put that very well. So you've got Diana Johnson coming back, Dame Diana Johnson, who was the Home Affairs Select Committee chair, and Stephen Timms coming back to work in the Work and Pensions brief. Now, actually, both of those have been ministers before under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. So that's good to see. We got some expertise there, and having held those departments to account, you'd think they're well informed to take on a ministerial job.
I think actually select committees are where some of the really interesting work of governing happens. The House of Commons, often you get sort of fiery debates and MPs trying to make their mark and lots of speeches, although the quality of the speeches, Freddie will back me up on this, varies immensely. There's huge variation there. But it's with select committees that MPs have time to really drill down and question whether it's experts like in the Post Office Horizon inquiry or whether it's ministers, and they can be so sort of meticulous, and those hearings are often really quite uncomfortable and very revealing. So anyone who has served on one of those committees, particularly someone who's chaired them, will have an in-depth understanding of the policy area.
Yeah, I think this reshuffle is very important because it's not really a reshuffle. Nothing's changed that much beyond
what we... It's not even a shuffle.
It's not even a shuffle. And I think that points to the fact that Keir Starmer is trying to get away. I'll ignore that. I'm trying to get away from this short-term politics that he talks about all the time, a symptom of which is constant reshuffles, the application of patronage, this infighting, this bitter briefing about people trying to climb the ladder, get into cabinet, and appointments being based on loyalty. So I think he's trying to move away from that. And if he can keep ministers in post for a very long time, as David Cameron did with Theresa May in the Home Office and William Hague in the Foreign Office, then you build up this experience, particularly for delivery departments, that allows them to try and implement all the change that they promised in the election. So I would expect people to be in post for a very long time, which increases the importance of all the appointments.
No, absolutely. And we've seen, as well as bringing back some more people from the old New Labour era, so Jackie Smith and Douglas Alexander. We're talking about people, from outside government who've been brought in who really, we have a sense that they know what they're talking about. So the big ones, I suppose, are Sir Patrick Vallance, who, of course, we all know from his daily COVID briefings. He's coming back as a science minister, obviously the government's chief scientific advisor during the pandemic. And also the one that everyone's talking about, James Timpson, to prisons minister. Rachel, this
I'm
is
really excited about this.
Yeah.
So James Timpson of the Timpsons chain, people might know that they have a scheme specifically for hiring ex-offenders and offering them training and giving them sort of leadership training and positions of authority, and 10% of Timpson's workforce are former prisoners.
And they also have a great thing that says if you don't have a clean outfit or you don't have an outfit for your interview, we'll clean it for you for free.
We'll clean it for you, yeah. So James Timpson is one of those people who in the sort of business private sector world who has got involved in policy through kind of bottom-up grassroots, like doing it and seeing what works. But he's also been an advisor on various initiatives to do with prison reform and rehabilitation. And he has spoken quite openly about the fact that there are people in prison who shouldn't be there, who are in prison because of successive failures of the state, whether it's to do with housing or mental health or to do with the failure of probation services. 45% of ex-offenders are back in prison within a year of leaving. So part of the prison's overcrowding crisis is to do with when people get out of prison, they're straight back in there sort of very quickly. And so putting somebody in that role who has a very clear view on what can and should be done, but that comes from direct experience with it, is really quite a statement. And it's particularly a statement because successive ministers in that area have been very cautious about anything that could make the government look weak on law and order. We don't want to let people out of prison. We don't want to look like people can sort of get away with crime. But the prisons are full. We knew that before the election. They're still full now. As Keir Starmer has said, you can't build a prison in 24 hours. And so a radical rethink of how to make the criminal justice system work, and particularly how to stop this revolving door, people get out of prison and straight back in, that's really important. Probably going to be quite unpopular at first.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I know you've written about prison reform in the past. I wrote a couple of weeks ago about this problem, talking to some insiders in the prison and justice system. And you know, they acknowledge this needs to be sorted now, but also any of the solutions or the potential solutions make any government, and particularly a Labour government, look quite weak. So it's perhaps, you know, pretty strategic on that front as well. But you're saying about the revolving door. I mean, interestingly, it's what we think about the purpose of prison, isn't it? Because since COVID in particular, one of the things that prisons are graded on, this thing called purposeful activity, which is, you know, doing something useful in prison, they're shockingly bad. I mean, and it's not come back. And this insider said to me, you know, if you got a 1, which is the lowest grade on safety, you'd get, excuse my language, a bollocking. If you get a 1 on purposeful activity, it's a shrugging of the shoulders. And yet, if you're trying to stop people coming back, then maybe a good thing to do would give them something useful to do when they're in prison.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because Keir Starmer was famous for being quite hard line when it came to punishment as DPP, particularly following the London riots in 2011. You know, he kept the courts open all night long. He had severe punishments for quite minor crimes in a relative setting, and now he's introduced someone to the government who prioritises rehabilitation over punishment. So that seems to be a switch in the way that he sees justice. It'll be interesting as well because he will obviously have so much experience that he'll constantly trying to be involved with policy, I would have thought, and more so than on the other areas. And the other thing on the prisons being full, I mean, Labour have said that they're going to have to let out prisoners early. I mean, this was sort of already happening under the government, but they didn't want the previous government, but they didn't want to speak about it. I think because they're at the start of their term, the Conservatives are in complete disarray. They can use these moments to sort of say all the uncomfortable things that 6 months down the line will make them very unpopular.
But one thing they could do in terms of letting people out early is that only, I mean, for the most serious offences, that only changed. It only got harsher for the most serious offences, a few years ago. So it wouldn't be a huge change. I mean, generally speaking, you're eligible for release halfway through your sentence, and now for the most serious criminals, it's 2/3. But I mean, yeah, you're right. With a huge majority, it's the time to do it now.
It's a change in attitude, though. So we shouldn't forget that Chris Grayling, when he was Justice Secretary, banned prisoners from receiving books.
Yeah.
Like, sort of, as attitudes go, like, are you in prison to be punished to the extent that we're not even going to let you read? Or while you're in prison, shall we try and teach you how to read so you have some chance of getting a job when you get out? Chris Grayling, by the way, got a peerage.
Lord.
And I feel like we haven't really discussed that at all because it happened on election night. But oh my God, Chris Grayling. I've had a lot of angry texts from Conservatives about that one.
Some interesting choices of peerages, actually. Hilary Cass, who led the Cass Review into children and young people's gender services, also going into the House of Lords as a crossbencher. Lots of the Labour grandees, particularly female grandees, Margaret Hodge, Harriet Harman, Margaret Beckett. The other name of kind of expert joining the Labour government, if you like, is Peter Hendy, former head of Transport for London. He's chair of National Rail, so that'll be interesting joining the transport brief.
It is. I mean, again, it points to the fact that Labour are trying to bring in business. They've been very clear about that. The fact that they want to cooperate. They've prioritised experience over new ideas or party loyalty, whatever it might be. So they're clawing into the establishment and bringing these people into government. I mean, you could say that's important in terms of having that experience, but I think some people will look at it and go, okay, well, these people have been in charge in many parts of the government for 15 years, and we've been in this, and we're in the problem we're in now. So maybe we shouldn't go to the same people. That would be another interpretation.
One final James Timpson fact is that his brother was a
Tory
Conservative minister.
yeah.
I don't know if that's the first time that's happened, where you've had two brothers who have been ministers for different parties. It may have happened at some point in history. I'm sure our listeners, if you know,
Absolutely, let us know.
will tell us. And we've also got two sisters in the cabinet for the first time ever. Rachel Reeves and Elliot Reeves, her sister, is Minister of State or Minister without portfolio, so she'll be attending cabinet as well.
Well, any fear that anyone may have had that Keir Starmer was going to take the weekends off as a part-time Prime Minister put to bed pretty quickly, hit the ground running on Friday and Saturday. Mm-hmm. What did you make of the first official press conference, Rachel? A difference in tone?
A difference in tone from what we've had previously, yes. A difference in tone from what we've heard from Keir Starmer. Not really, talking again about government of service and a government for the whole United Kingdom, whether it was you voted for him or not, similar to what he said outside Downing Street. And really this sense of, in this country, things should work, and where you are born, your situation when you're born shouldn't hold you back, which isn't that surprising given that what we've seen from him and again some of the people in his cabinet. But it felt like a reaching out, not to the other parties, but to other voters, sort of recognition that majority of the country didn't vote for him, which is something that I'm sure we'll be talking about a lot in the coming weeks, months and years, but that the kind of structural changes that he wants to make to the country are, he hopes, for everyone, not just people who voted Labour.
And he made a point, didn't he, of saying he's proud that this is the most state-educated, most female cabinet ever. I'm really proud of the fact that my cabinet reflects the aspiration that I believe lies at the heart of our country. It is, I mean, it's really a big difference to the previous Conservative cabinets we've seen, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, with the past 14 years, apart from Theresa May's cabinet, it's all been around 60-70% private school education. Under Blair and Brown, I think it was down to 20-30, but Keir Starmer's is 4%. So it's the vast majority of them went to
that's
state
even under
school.
the national average.
Exactly.
It's two people, isn't it?
I think some of them went to private school for a little bit, and that's why they got like sort of 4%.
Okay.
But yeah, it's way below. It was lowest ever. So yeah, I think he's proud of that. I mean, the press conference on Saturday was the same themes. He was trying to be honest, open. I don't think he was trying to use any soaring rhetoric and inspire the nation. I think the whole point for this 5 days is to show that Labour are working to deliver the change they promised. They know that all of the things that we've spoken about before will require years to fix, but they want to give the impression that they're taking action, and that's why we've seen all the announcements we've seen so far. Yvette Cooper saying that they're going to appoint a commander for this border security command, Keir Starmer travelling the nation, etc., etc.
But it's interesting him travelling the length and breadth of the UK, isn't it? Because he's had a really positive response already. I mean, yesterday in Scotland, meeting First Minister John Swinney, both men talking about it very favourably. Today he's been in Northern Ireland and Wales, and I think the Sinn Féin president, Mary Lou McDonald, she compared her conversations with Keir Starmer as with the previous Conservative government as a difference between daylight and dark.
Yeah, but it's quite a low bar, isn't it? So, and it's not to discredit Labour at all, but they recognise with Europe, with NATO, with the devolved administrations, there's been such a poor relationship for so many years that they're going to have to fix it. And Rishi Sunak went some way to do this with the Windsor Framework and restoring diplomacy with the EU, but they want to go further. I mean, if you look at some of the arguments we've had between the SNP and Holyrood and the Conservative government, that relationship's obviously not going very well at all. The same with the Europe and
No, for
NATO.
sure, but that's probably why we've seen the travel over the weekend.
No, completely, and it's really important, and they've been very clear that that's what they're going to do. They're going to reset the relationships because they think they can't achieve anything on top of that unless they do so first.
I'm not sure how long it's going to last because let's not forget that we've got Holyrood elections coming up in a year or so, and the SNP will be very keen to put the boot into Labour, and the independence cause hasn't gone away. So it's a brief honeymoon
Well, I remember
period.
speaking to someone in the SNP or a couple of MPs before the election, they were quite confident. I mean, they said they were anyway, that in these 2 years they'll be able to say to the country, look, Labour, even when you've got a Labour government, even when you've got rid of Boris Johnson and the Tories, it's still not very good. So that's what they're hoping they'll be able to say in 26.
That's probably before they got pretty much wiped out on Thursday night.
One more thing about Starmer's speech is that he talked about how he was going to be meeting the metro mayors and the regional mayors, and he explicitly said in the press conference, not just the Labour ones, and he said because Labour doesn't have a monopoly on good ideas or something to that effect. And this goes back to something that he said multiple times, in that politics doesn't have to be tribal, and if somebody has a good idea for improving their area, he wants to hear it. I imagine he'll be working with Ben Houchen, who is, in a way, the most senior elected Conservative at the moment, and various others. And that is kind of interesting too. And it'll be interesting to see how long that lasts, because when local councils were on the brink of bankruptcy, every time one of them got into financial distress, the line from the government was because they've been mismanaged by Labour councillors, even though we know that councils, regardless of their leadership, are in trouble up and down the country. It's not a Labour problem, it's not a Tory problem. It's sort of universal. And that is a marked change as well, kind of recognising that if you're going to have devolved layers of government, you have to have good working relationships between those different layers.
Oh, it feels like the grown-ups are back in the room, really, doesn't
People
it?
did say that about Rishi Sunak, though, so just be a bit careful.
Okay, fair enough. But you know, building on what you say, Freddie, I mean, already David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, and John Healey, the Defence Secretary, have been putting the air miles in this weekend, haven't they? David Lammy's been to Poland, Germany and Sweden. John Healey's been in Odessa talking about Ukraine, and then obviously we've got the NATO summit. I mean, what do we think foreign affairs is going to be absolutely at the heart of this Labour government?
It's interesting, isn't it? Every Prime Minister comes in having fought a campaign on domestic issues, and then they get consumed by foreign affairs straight away because they're the representative of the government abroad, much more so than the Foreign Secretary. We're seeing that this week. Keir Starmer is going to go to Washington, D.C., and he's going to have to meet all of these leaders at the NATO summit, when perhaps he'd rather be focusing on some of the issues that he spoke about during the general election. Same thing happened with Rishi Sunak. He didn't really want to focus on foreign affairs, hence he appointed Cameron as Foreign Secretary. But inevitably you have to. So that'd be an interesting dynamic to watch.
I mean, big focus today, obviously, Rachel Reeves as well on planning reform and mandatory housing targets. She has said, sort of maybe expectation management, that Labour has inherited the worst set of circumstances since the Second World War. But they certainly are hitting the ground running. Wes Streeting meeting the BMA tomorrow to try and solve the doctors' strike, junior doctors' strike, sorry. Finally, Let's touch on an extraordinary night in French politics as well. Really defied all expectations.
We talked about when Macron decided to call the election how it was a massive gamble. And then when we had the first round of voting, we sort of said it's a gamble that really didn't pay off. And now looking at the second round, the National Rally, Marine Le Pen's party coming in third place, it looks a little bit like that gamble did pay off. On the other hand, there was no huge enthusiasm for Macron's party, and that result was only possible because of all of the sort of mad scramble that his party and the collection of left-wing parties sort of did in various seats to try and make sure that there was a Le Pen candidate and an anti-Le Pen candidate. So it's not really a vote of confidence for Macron, and how that parliament is now going to function, I don't think anyone really has a strong idea.
No, I mean, the gamble did not pay off. This is an absolute disaster. You've got liberal commentators across Twitter celebrating the fact that they think that the far right didn't do as well as it could have. It's like, yeah, sure, but it still came third and it still got more seats than it did last time, and it won the first round. So there's this complacency just because they're not in government and you're not going to have a National Rally Prime Minister, that for some reason then everything's fine and we can trot on as we always have. I don't think that's the case.
Do you think it was a mistake for him to call this snap election?
Well, it seems like it, yeah, because he's had to ask his Prime Minister to stay on even though the Prime Minister wants to go. He's now lost control of Parliament. He's going to struggle to get any legislation through. There's going to be gridlock, and he's going to platform to the far left. So I don't think it's gone as he wanted.
I don't think it's gone as he wanted, but I think his gamble was sort of partly based on looking ahead to 2027 and the presidential election, and hoping that if he could, find a way to neutralise Marine Le Pen's party, or to sort of show that they weren't serious because they're in Parliament and they're not able to do very much, maybe that would help reduce the threat in 2027. I don't think we'll know that until 2027.
Yeah, but they're not going to be in government now. And so they're not going to be tarnished by government. They've got a bigger platform than they had before, and they can still carp on the sidelines. So I think they'll do quite well.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, you said that he's had to ask, Macron's had to ask his own Prime Minister to stay on. We're in a state of gridlock. Lots of talk over the last 72 hours about our electoral system and, particularly when you look at the Greens and Reform, talk of PR, but actually we've had a very dignified, calm, respectful transfer of power. First past the post delivers strong governments. I think we look across the water and maybe it's all not that great to have PR, but up for debate.
Wait for the comments on that one.
They all have their advantages and disadvantages.
It's a conversation for another podcast.
Indeed. If you'd like to submit a question for us to discuss on a future podcast, you can do so at newstatesman.com/you ask us. Or if you're watching on YouTube, leave a question in the comments.